The autumn sun had barely risen over the hills of Thornfield when Helen Ward started her daily routine. At 67 years old, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that structure and routine were the best medicines for a troubled mind. She filled her kettle, placed 2 slices of bread in the toaster, and glanced at the calendar hanging on her kitchen wall. October 15th. Another ordinary Tuesday in a life built carefully on ordinary days. Through her kitchen window, she could see Main Street beginning to wake up. Old Mr. Patterson was opening his hardware store, and across the street, the bakery's lights had been on for hours already. The smell of fresh bread sometimes drifted all the way to her small house on Maple Avenue. Thornfield was a town of routines, and Helen had become part of its rhythm 22 years ago. She ate her breakfast in silence, as she always did. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of old wood settling. It was a small house, perfect for one person. 2 bedrooms, though she only used one. A living room with worn but comfortable furniture. A kitchen that got good morning light. Nothing fancy, nothing that drew attention. Exactly what she had wanted when she first came to Thornfield. After breakfast, Helen put on her uniform, navy blue pants and a matching shirt with Thornfield School District embroidered on the pocket. She tied her gray hair back in a practical bun, the same style she had worn for decades. In the mirror, she saw a face marked by time and experience. Lines around her eyes, deeper ones around her mouth. She thought she looked like any other woman her age. Nobody who looked at her would guess what she had once been. At 6:45 a.m., Helen walked to her garage. The school bus sat there, yellow and clean. She had washed it the previous afternoon, as she did every week. Taking care of the bus was part of taking care of the children who rode in it. She had been driving this route for 20 years now, and she knew every child, every stop, every parent. The engine started with its familiar rumble. Helen backed out carefully, waving to Mrs. Chen, who was collecting her newspaper from the front lawn. Mrs. Chen waved back enthusiastically. "Morning, Helen," she called out. "Good morning, Margaret," Helen replied. These small exchanges made up the fabric of her days. Simple greetings, friendly waves, occasional conversations about the weather or whose garden was doing well. It was a gentle life, and Helen had worked hard to deserve it. Her first stop was the Jennings family home on Oak Street. Tommy and Sarah Jennings, 8 and 10 years old, were already waiting at the end of their driveway. Their mother stood with them, coffee cup in hand. Helen pulled up and opened the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Ward," the children chorused as they climbed aboard. "Good morning, Tommy, Sarah," Helen responded with a warm smile. "Did you both finish your homework?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said proudly. "I got an A on my science project." "That's wonderful, Sarah. I'm proud of you." These conversations were precious to Helen. The children trusted her. She took them safely to school every morning and brought them safely home every afternoon. It was a responsibility she never took lightly. In some way she couldn't quite explain to herself, this job had become a kind of redemption. The route continued through Thornfield's residential streets. Helen picked up 15 children in total, ranging from 6 to 12 years old. She knew all their names, knew which ones sat together, knew who needed a little extra encouragement in the morning. Billy Morrison was always sleepy. The Patterson twins were always energetic. Little Emma Rodriguez was shy, but had been slowly opening up over the past year. "Mrs. Ward," Emma said quietly from her seat near the front, "I brought you something." She held out a small drawing, a yellow school bus with a smiling driver in the window. Helen's throat tightened with emotion. Emma, this is beautiful. Thank you so much. You're welcome, Emma whispered, her cheeks pink with pleasure. These moments reminded Helen why she had chosen this job, why she had chosen this life. After everything that had happened, after everything she had done, being trusted with these children felt like a gift she didn't deserve, but accepted with gratitude. The elementary school came into view at 7:30 a.m. Helen pulled into the circular drive and opened the door. Everyone have a great day, she said as the children filed out. Learn something new. Bye, Mrs. Ward, they called back, some waving, some already running toward their friends. Helen watched them go, making sure each one made it safely to the building. Only when the last child had disappeared inside did she close the door and drive the bus to the school district's parking lot. Her morning route was complete. She wouldn't drive again until 3 p.m., when she would retrace her path and bring the children home. She had a few hours now. On most days, she went home and tended to her small garden, read books from the library, or did volunteer work at the community center. Helen had learned to fill her days with quiet, useful activities. Idle time was dangerous. Idle time let the memories creep in. But today was Tuesday, which meant she had her regular coffee meeting with Dorothy and Francis at the Bluebird Cafe. This weekly gathering had become one of the highlights of Helen's week, though she had resisted it at first when Dorothy had invited her 7 years ago. The Bluebird Cafe sat on the corner of Main and 2nd Street, its blue and white awning a cheerful landmark in downtown Thornfield. It had been run by the same family for 40 years, and according to local legend, the coffee was the best in 3 counties. Helen didn't know about that, but she did know that the cafe represented something important in her life: belonging. Dorothy Fletcher was already there when Helen arrived, sitting at their usual table by the window. Dorothy was 72. A retired schoolteacher with snow-white hair and an endless supply of colorful scarves. Today's was purple with gold trim. Helen! Right on time as always, Dorothy greeted her with a warm smile. Francis called. She's running a few minutes late. Her grandson is visiting. That's nice. I'll get the coffee, Helen said, heading to the counter. Young Jake Barrett, who ran the cafe now that his father had semi-retired, grinned at her approach. The usual, Mrs. Ward? Please, Jake. And one for Dorothy. Coming right up. Hey, I heard Tommy Jennings talking about you yesterday. Said you helped him with his math homework at the bus stop. Helen shrugged. It was just simple multiplication. He was stuck on one problem. Still, it's nice of you. My mom always says you're the best thing that happened to our school system. Helen felt the familiar discomfort that came with praise. She accepted the coffee and returned to the table where Dorothy was watching her with knowing eyes. You still don't know how to take a compliment, do you? Dorothy said gently. I just do my job, Helen replied, sitting down. Nonsense. You do far more than your job. You care about those kids. Everyone sees it. Before Helen could respond, Francis Moretti bustled through the door. Francis was 65, a former nurse with boundless energy and opinions on everything. She spotted them and waved, then detoured to the counter to get her own coffee before joining them. Sorry, Francis said, dropping into her chair with a sigh. Marco wanted to show me every single Pokemon card he owns. Do you know how many that is? 237. I counted. Dorothy laughed. How old is Marco now? 9, and absolutely obsessed with those cards. But I'm not complaining. It's wonderful having him visit. Francis turned to Helen. How was your morning route? Smooth as always. Sarah Jennings got an A on her science project. That's Bob and Linda's girl, right? Frances said. Smart as a whip, that one. Takes after her mother. The three women fell into easy conversation. They talked about their gardens, about the upcoming town festival, about Mrs. Patterson's new hip and how well she was recovering. These conversations were comfortable, familiar. Helen had been meeting with Dorothy and Frances every Tuesday morning for years now, and somewhere along the way, they had become more than acquaintances. They had become friends. Did you hear about the Henderson situation? Dorothy asked, lowering her voice slightly. I heard they're having money troubles, Frances confirmed. Medical bills from when Tim had his accident last year. I ran into Barbara at the grocery store and she looked exhausted. That's terrible, Helen said. Is there anything we can do? The church is organizing a fundraiser dinner, Dorothy explained. I'm helping coordinate it. We could use more volunteers if you're interested. Of course, Helen said immediately. Let me know what you need. This was another pattern in Helen's life. She volunteered for everything. Church events, town cleanups, the library book sale, the annual food drive. Part of it was genuine desire to help. Part of it was penance, though she never said that aloud. And part of it was simply needing to stay busy. You know what Thornfield needs? Frances declared suddenly. A proper community garden. We have all these empty lots downtown, and I keep thinking we could turn one into a shared garden space. People could have plots, grow vegetables, build community. That's actually a wonderful idea, Dorothy said thoughtfully. We should propose it at the next town council meeting. Would you help? Frances asked Helen. You have the best garden in town. You could teach people. Helen hesitated. Leading something, being visible, these things still made her nervous even after all these years. But she saw the enthusiasm in Frances's face and found herself nodding. I'd be happy to help however I can. Excellent! I knew I could count on you. They talked for another hour, their conversation ranging from serious community issues to lighter gossip about whose grandson was dating whom. Helen mostly listened, contributing when asked, but comfortable letting Dorothy and Frances carry most of the discussion. This had always been her role in social situations. Present, but not central. Friendly, but not the focus. At one point, a young woman entered the cafe with a baby in a stroller. Dorothy immediately cooed over the infant, and Frances launched into advice about teething remedies. Helen watched but didn't approach. Babies and young children sometimes brought back uncomfortable memories, not of her military service, but of the life she had never had. At 67, she had no children, had never married, had no family left. Her parents were long dead, and she had been an only child. Sometimes, Helen wondered what her life would have been like if she had made different choices. But those thoughts were dangerous territory, and she had learned to redirect her mind when it wandered that direction. Earth to Helen, Frances was saying with a laugh. Where did you go just now? Sorry, just thinking about the garden project, Helen lied smoothly. Years of practice had made her good at these small deceptions. Well, save those thoughts for our planning meeting. Right now, I want to hear about your upcoming trip to the coast. Helen blinked. What trip? The one you're going to plan right now, Frances insisted. Helen, you never take vacations. You never go anywhere. When was the last time you left Thornfield? I went to the city for supplies last month. That doesn't count. I mean a real trip, for fun. Helen felt a flash of panic. Leaving Thornfield, even temporarily, felt dangerous. This town was her safe place, her carefully constructed refuge. I'm not really a vacation person, she said carefully. Everyone is a vacation person, Dorothy chimed in. Frances is right. You work hard, you volunteer constantly, and you never do anything just for yourself. You deserve a break. I'll think about it, Helen said, knowing she wouldn't. But her friends meant well, and she appreciated their concern even as she had no intention of following their advice. The conversation moved on, and Helen was relieved. She finished her coffee and glanced at the clock. Almost time to head home and prepare for the afternoon route. Same time next week? Dorothy asked as they prepared to leave. Wouldn't miss it, Helen confirmed. Walking back to her car, Helen reflected on how much had changed since she first arrived in Thornfield. Back then, she had been a ghost, barely functional, just trying to survive each day. She hadn't wanted friends, hadn't wanted connections. But Dorothy had been persistent, and Frances had been impossible to refuse, and somehow, Helen had ended up with a life again. It wasn't the life she had once imagined for herself. There were no medals, no achievements, no recognition. But there was peace, most days. There was purpose. There were children who greeted her happily every morning, and friends who made her laugh over coffee. It was enough. It had to be enough. Helen's house was silent when she returned. She made herself a simple lunch, a sandwich and an apple, and sat at her kitchen table, Emma's drawing propped up where she could see it. The child had drawn the bus carefully, with windows and wheels precisely placed. The stick figure driver had a smiling face and gray hair. In the corner, Emma had written in careful letters, "Thank you, Mrs. Ward." These small kindnesses from the children touched Helen deeply. They didn't know what those thanks meant to her. They couldn't know how much she needed to believe she was doing something good, something that mattered. After lunch, Helen went to her small second bedroom, which she used partly as a storage room and partly as an office. On one wall hung a calendar and some local maps. On the desk sat her laptop, a notebook, and some library books. Everything was neat and organized. Helen had always been organized, even before the military formalized that tendency into an iron discipline. She opened the laptop, intending to check the weather forecast and maybe read the news. But as she waited for it to boot up, her eyes drifted to the closet. At the back of that closet, in a box she hadn't opened in years, were the remnants of her former life. Helen stood up, drawn by an impulse she didn't quite understand. She opened the closet and moved aside some boxes of winter clothes until she found the plain cardboard box, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Her hands hesitated over it. "Don't," she told herself aloud. "Leave it alone." But something made her pull the box out anyway. She carried it to the desk and sat down, staring at it. For 5 full minutes, she just looked at the box, her heart beating faster than normal. Then, with movements that felt disconnected from her will, she found scissors and cut the tape. Inside were things she hadn't seen in over 2 decades. Her dog tags, tarnished now. Several medals in small cases. A photograph of her squadron, all of them young and confident in their flight suits, standing in front of their aircraft. Helen, at 35, her hair still dark, her face unlined. She looked like a stranger now. There were commendations, certificates, letters of recognition. Major Helen Ward had been exceptional at her job. She had logged over 3,000 flight hours. She had served in conflicts she wasn't permitted to discuss. She had been decorated for valor, for precision, for excellence. And then there were the other papers. The incident report. The investigation documentation. the medical evaluation that mentioned PTSD, anxiety, depression. The letter of resignation she had written with shaking hands. Helen picked up the photograph of her squadron. She could name every person in it. Captain Robert Morrison, who had died 3 years later in a training accident. Lieutenant Sarah Keller, who had gone on to become a colonel. Captain James O'Brien, who had left the service around the same time Helen did, though for different reasons. Strike Team Phoenix, they had called themselves. The best of the best. Helen had been so proud to be part of that team. Flying had been everything to her. The freedom, the precision, the sense of serving something larger than herself. She could still remember the feeling of pulling a fighter jet into a steep climb, the G-forces pressing her into her seat, the world falling away beneath her. She had loved flying the way some people loved music or art. It had been her calling, her passion, her identity. Until it wasn't. Helen pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping she had kept, though she didn't know why. The headline read, "Military acknowledges mistake in strike on civilian area." The article was clinical, discussing incorrect coordinates and intelligence failures and regrettable but unintended consequences. What the article didn't capture was Helen sitting in a briefing room, being shown satellite photos of the damage. A residential area in a small town. Buildings destroyed. People injured, though thankfully none killed. A miracle, they had told her, as if that made it better. Families displaced. Children terrified. The coordinates had been wrong. The intelligence had been faulty. Helen had followed her orders precisely, hit her target exactly. She had done nothing wrong according to military procedures and protocols, but she had been the one in the cockpit, her hands on the controls, her finger on the trigger. When she closed her eyes, she could still see the target exploding below her, could still feel the satisfaction she had felt in that moment before she knew. The satisfaction of a perfect strike. Except it hadn't been perfect. It had been a disaster. Helen's hands were trembling now. She put the clipping down and closed her eyes, doing the breathing exercises her therapist had taught her all those years ago. Count to 4 breathing in. Hold for 4. Count to 4 breathing out. Hold for 4. Repeat. The panic attack that had been building slowly receded. Helen opened her eyes and looked at the scattered contents of the box. Why had she done this to herself? She had learned years ago that revisiting the past only brought pain, but maybe there was a reason she had opened the box today. Maybe she needed to remember not just the pain, but also who she had been. Helen had been a good pilot. She had saved lives on missions that did go right. She had protected people, defended values she believed in. The person in these photographs wasn't a monster. She was a dedicated officer who had made a terrible mistake. That thought helped somehow. Helen began putting the items carefully back in the box. She had built a new life in Thornfield, but her past was still part of her. Denying it entirely wasn't healthy either. She could acknowledge what had been without letting it destroy what was. As she taped the box shut again, Helen made a decision. She would keep the box, but she wouldn't hide it in the back of the closet anymore. She placed it on a shelf where she could see it, acknowledging its presence without letting it dominate her life. The laptop had gone to sleep. Helen woke it up and checked the time. 2:30 p.m. Time to head to the school for the afternoon route. The elementary school was chaos at 3 p.m., as it always was. Children poured out of the building, shouting to friends, showing off art projects, arguing about who got to play with what at recess. Helen stood by her bus, checking off names as her passengers boarded. "Hi, Mrs. Ward," Tommy Jennings called out, climbing up the steps with his backpack dragging behind him. "Hello, Tommy. How was your day?" "Good. We had pizza for lunch." The simple enthusiasm of an 8-year-old made Helen smile. Soon all 15 children were aboard, buckled into their seats, their voices creating a cheerful noise that Helen had learned to tune in to a pleasant background hum. She drove carefully, as always. The afternoon route reversed the morning path, dropping children off one by one until the bus was empty. It was deeply satisfying work, taking responsibility for these young lives, making sure they got home safely. They were heading down Oakwood Avenue when Helen noticed something unusual. A police car was parked at the intersection ahead, lights flashing. Officer Mike Davidson stood in the road, directing traffic around something. As Helen approached, she saw what it was. A large tree branch had fallen across one lane. "Mrs. Ward," Officer Davidson called out, recognizing her. "You'll need to take the detour through Pine Street." "No problem, Mike. Is everyone okay?" "Yeah, just a big branch that came down in that wind we had earlier. We'll have it cleared soon." Helen nodded and followed the detour. The children barely noticed, too busy with their conversations and games. This was the kind of minor disruption that happened regularly. A detour here, a delayed train crossing there. Helen was good at adapting, at finding alternative routes. The detour took them past the First National Bank of Thornfield, a small brick building that had served the community for over 80 years. Helen had her accounts there, like almost everyone in town. She knew all the tellers by name. As the bus rolled past, Helen automatically glanced at the bank and felt her muscles tense. Something was wrong. She couldn't have said exactly what triggered her instinct. Maybe it was the way the front door was propped open on a cool October day. Maybe it was the complete absence of people visible through the windows. Maybe it was something more subtle, a detail her trained eyes picked up without conscious recognition. Helen slowed the bus slightly, looking more carefully. There, through the window, a woman on the floor, not moving, and a figure in dark clothing standing over the counter. Her military training, dormant for so long, suddenly activated. Assess the situation, process information, make decisions, all in split seconds. This was a robbery in progress. Helen's first instinct was to call the police immediately, but her radio only connected to the school district office, not to emergency services. Her personal cell phone was in her bag, not immediately accessible while driving. More importantly, she had 15 children on the bus. Her absolute priority had to be getting them away from potential danger. Helen drove past the bank without stopping, maintaining normal speed. She didn't want to do anything that might alert the robbers to her observation. The children continued chattering, unaware that anything unusual had happened. 2 blocks away, Helen pulled over at a spot where she could see back toward the bank. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Helen Ward. I'm a school bus driver and I just drove past the First National Bank on Main Street. I believe there's a robbery in progress. I saw someone on the floor and suspicious activity inside. The dispatcher's voice sharpened. Are you safe? Are the children safe? Yes, we're 2 blocks away. I have 15 children on the bus. We're parked at the corner of Main and Sycamore. Stay on the line. Units are responding now. Do not approach the bank. I understand. Helen could hear the dispatcher coordinating with police officers. She kept watch on the bank, her heart pounding, but her hands steady on the wheel. Years of military training had taught her how to function while afraid. Within minutes, 2 police cars appeared, sirens off but moving quickly. They positioned themselves near the bank. Helen saw officers getting out, weapons drawn, taking cover behind their vehicles. "Mrs. Ward," said a girl's voice from behind her. "Why did we stop?" Helen turned to see Emma Rodriguez looking at her with worried eyes. Several other children were now paying attention, sensing that something was different. "It's okay, sweetheart," Helen said calmly. "There's just some police activity ahead. We're going to wait here for a few minutes until it's safe to continue our route." "Are the police catching bad guys?" Billy Morrison asked, his eyes wide. "The police are just doing their job," Helen said carefully. "Everyone sit tight. We'll be moving again soon." Through her rearview mirror, Helen watched the situation at the bank unfold. More police cars arrived. Officers in tactical gear appeared. Someone was using a megaphone, though Helen couldn't hear the words from this distance. The 911 dispatcher was still on the line. "Mrs. Ward, officers on scene confirm there is an active robbery. Can you see anything from your position?" "Not clearly. I'm about 2 blocks west. I have visual on your units, but not on the bank entrance." "Good. Please stay where you are. We'll let you know when it's safe to move." Helen agreed and ended the call, then immediately called the school district office. "Thornfield School District, this is Paula." "Paula, it's Helen Ward. I need you to contact the parents of all the children on my route. There's a police situation on Main Street and we're delayed. Everyone is safe, but parents should know we'll be late." Paula's voice filled with concern. "What kind of situation?" "I believe there's a robbery at the bank. We're not in danger, but we can't continue the route until the police give us clearance." "Oh my God. Okay, I'll start calling parents right away. Are you sure you're all safe?" "Completely safe. We're well away from the scene." After ending that call, Helen focused on keeping the children calm. Several were now asking questions, and a few of the younger ones looked scared. "Listen, everyone," Helen said in her most reassuring voice. "You know how sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to solve? Well, the police are solving a problem right now, and we just need to wait here while they do their job. You're all perfectly safe, I promise." "My mom works at that bank," Sarah Jennings said suddenly, her voice small and frightened. Helen's heart clenched. Linda Jennings was one of the tellers. "Sarah, honey, I'm sure your mom is fine. The police are very good at their jobs. They're going to make sure everyone stays safe." But Sarah's eyes were filling with tears. "Can we call her, please?" "The police need everyone to stay off their phones right now," Helen said gently. "But I promise you, as soon as we can, we'll make sure your mom is okay." Tommy put his arm around his sister. "It's okay, Sarah. Mrs. Ward said the police are there. They'll help Mom." Helen felt a swell of emotion at the boy's protectiveness toward his sister. These children trusted her. They believed her when she said everything would be okay. She needed to live up to that trust. Time seemed to stretch. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Helen kept up a steady stream of conversation with the children, directing their attention away from worry. She had them sing some songs they knew from music class. She asked them about their favorite subjects, anything to keep them distracted. Her phone rang. It was Officer Davidson. "Mrs. Ward, it's Mike. I heard you were the one who spotted the robbery." "Is everyone okay? Sarah Jennings's mother works at that bank." "Everyone inside is safe, but we have a situation. 3 suspects barricaded inside. They're demanding a vehicle and safe passage. We're trying to negotiate." He paused. "And Mrs. Ward? They have a hostage." Helen's blood went cold. "Who?" "Richard Matthews, the bank manager. They grabbed him when they realized we were outside. Richard Matthews. Helen knew him. He had helped her open her accounts when she first moved to Thornfield. He was 60 years old, a kind man with a gentle voice. "What can I do?" Helen asked. "Right now, just stay put with those kids and keep them calm. You're doing great. We'll let you know when you can move." After Mike hung up, Helen sat very still, processing this information. A hostage situation. 3 armed suspects. In Thornfield, a town that rarely saw anything worse than vandalism or the occasional drunk driver. She looked at the children in her mirror. They were watching her, sensing her tension even though she was trying to hide it. "Mrs. Ward?" Emma asked quietly. "Is someone hurt?" Helen made a decision. These children deserved honesty appropriate to their age. "No one is hurt," she said firmly. "But there are some people who made bad choices. And now the police have to convince them to make better choices. It might take a little while. Your parents all know where we are, and they know you're safe with me." "My dad's probably worried," Billy Morrison said. "I'm sure he is," Helen agreed. "But he also knows I'm taking good care of you. All of your parents know that." The children seemed to accept this. Helen pulled out some coloring books and pencils she kept on the bus for special occasions. Soon, most of the younger children were drawing, their natural resilience helping them adapt to the strange situation. But Helen's mind was racing. She was watching the police activity, her old training automatically analyzing what she saw. The tactical positioning, the communication patterns, the careful approach to the building. She had been in similar situations before, though from a very different perspective. In the military, she had provided air support for hostage rescues, for tactical operations. She understood the principles: contain the situation, establish communication, negotiate if possible, use force only as a last resort. But this was different. This was her town. These were her people. And she was just a bus driver now, not a military officer. She had no role to play except to keep these children safe and wait for the professionals to handle it. Still, old instincts were hard to shake. Helen found herself studying the situation with a tactical eye, noting details, imagining scenarios. It was automatic, unconscious. The person she had been might be buried, but that person wasn't entirely gone. 45 minutes passed. The police presence had grown considerably. Helen counted 5 patrol cars, 2 SWAT vehicles, and what looked like a command center set up in a van. For a small town like Thornfield, this represented virtually the entire local law enforcement capacity. She was considering whether to let the children call their parents when she heard something that made her blood freeze. Sirens. Not police sirens. An ambulance. Dispatcher said someone collapsed inside. A voice crackled on the police radio. Helen had tuned her bus radio to the emergency frequency once the situation started, something she technically wasn't supposed to do but felt was necessary under the circumstances. Suspect or hostage? Unknown. The suspects are demanding the ambulance come in, but command thinks it might be a trick. Helen's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The situation was escalating. Someone was hurt, or pretending to be hurt. Either way, it complicated everything. Then things happened very quickly. Helen saw movement at the bank. The front door burst open. 3 figures emerged, all masked, all carrying bags. They were dragging someone with them. Richard Matthews, Helen realized. The bank manager's face was visible, pale and frightened. "They're coming out," Helen said to herself. The suspects moved fast, forcing Richard toward a car parked in front of the bank. Police shouted commands, weapons were drawn, but no one fired. Too much risk of hitting the hostage. The suspects threw Richard into a sedan and jumped in themselves. The car engine roared to life. "They're running," Helen breathed. The sedan peeled out of the parking spot, tires squealing. It headed west on Main Street, directly toward where Helen had parked the bus. "Oh no," Helen said. She watched the sedan approach at high speed. Police cars began pursuit, but they were seconds behind. The suspects were running from a robbery with a hostage, and they were desperate. The sedan was going to pass right by the school bus. Helen made a split-second decision. She started the bus engine. "Everyone hold on," she called to the children. "Stay in your seats." "Mrs. Ward?" Tommy's voice was frightened. There was no time to explain. The sedan was approaching fast. It would pass them in seconds. Beyond the bus, Helen could see that Main Street continued straight for 2 blocks before intersecting with the highway entrance. If the suspects reached the highway, pursuit would become much more difficult. They could disappear into the network of rural roads beyond Thornfield. But Helen knew these roads. She had driven them for 20 years. She knew every turn, every intersection, every feature. And she knew something else. A mile ahead, Main Street narrowed where it crossed over Thornfield Creek. The bridge was old, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. If she could reach that bridge first. It was crazy. It was dangerous. It was completely outside her role as a bus driver. But Helen had been a pilot. She had been trained to make split-second tactical decisions. She had been trained to assess situations and act decisively. That training, dormant for so long, suddenly roared back to life. She pulled the bus out onto Main Street. "Mrs. Ward!" several children shouted at once. "Trust me," Helen called back. "Stay in your seats and hold on." The school bus accelerated. It was not a fast vehicle, but Helen knew how to get the most out of its engine. More importantly, she knew the road ahead with perfect precision. In her rearview mirror, she saw the suspect's sedan approaching rapidly. They would catch up to the bus in seconds. But Helen wasn't trying to outrun them. She was trying to outthink them. Main Street had a slight curve ahead, and Helen took it at precisely the right angle and speed. She was driving on instinct now, but it was practiced instinct. Years of driving this route had taught her every inch of asphalt. Behind her, the suspect's sedan followed. They were closing distance. In seconds, they would be right behind the bus. "Move!" Helen heard them shouting. One leaned out the window. "Get that damn bus out of the way!" But Helen didn't move. She stayed centered in the lane, maintaining her speed. The bus was wide, blocking the entire lane. The sedan couldn't pass. They tried anyway. The sedan veered into the oncoming lane, trying to go around. But Helen had anticipated this. Just as they moved left, Helen drifted slightly left herself, not dangerously, but enough to force the sedan back behind her. "What is that idiot doing?" one of the suspects shouted. What Helen was doing was herding them. Like a sheepdog guiding sheep, she was controlling their path with the bus's bulk and position. She stayed just ahead of them, preventing them from passing, forcing them to follow her path. In her mirrors, Helen could see police cars behind the sedan, keeping pace but not too close. They couldn't risk a high-speed pursuit with a hostage in the suspect's vehicle. They were following, waiting for an opportunity. Ahead, the Thornfield Creek Bridge approached. Helen had timed it perfectly. She increased speed slightly, reaching the bridge just as the sedan made another attempt to pass. But the bridge was narrow, only one lane in each direction, with concrete barriers on the sides. There was no room to maneuver. Helen guided the bus onto the bridge, then did something that required precise judgment and years of experience. She slowed down. Not suddenly, that would have caused a collision, but gradually, reducing speed in a way that forced the sedan to slow as well or risk hitting the bus from behind. Behind the sedan, police cars were closing in. Helen had created a bottleneck. The suspects were trapped between the slow-moving bus ahead and police behind, with concrete barriers on both sides preventing escape. "Back up!" one suspect shouted at their driver. "Back up!" But backing up meant driving directly into police cars. They were stuck. Helen brought the bus to a complete stop in the middle of the bridge. She engaged the parking brake and opened her door, the signal that she was not going to move. Through her mirror, she saw everything happening at once. Police officers emerged from their vehicles, weapons drawn. More units arrived, sealing off both ends of the bridge. There was nowhere for the suspects to go. One suspect jumped out of the sedan and ran toward the bridge railing, but officers were already there. Another tried to use Richard Matthews as a shield, but Helen saw Chief of Police Tom Harrison approaching with his hands raised, talking in a calm voice. "This is over," Chief Harrison was saying. "There's nowhere to go. Let Mr. Matthews go and nobody else needs to get hurt." The standoff lasted less than a minute. Faced with overwhelming police presence and no escape route, the suspects surrendered. Officers moved in carefully, securing each suspect and checking on Richard Matthews. Helen sat in the driver's seat, her hands shaking now with adrenaline. What had she done? She had used a school bus full of children, to stop fleeing criminals. It had worked, but the risk. "Mrs. Ward," a small voice said behind her. That was really cool. Helen turned to see Tommy Jennings looking at her with wide eyes. Several other children were staring at her with similar expressions of awe. That was not what I'm supposed to do," Helen said weakly. "That was very, very dangerous, and you should never." "You stopped the bad guys," Billy Morrison interrupted. "You're like a superhero." Before Helen could respond, there was a knock on the bus door. Officer Mike Davidson stood there, his expression a mix of shock, relief, and something that might have been anger. "Mrs. Ward," he said, "I need you to step out of the bus, please." Still, old instincts were hard to shake. Helen found herself studying the situation with a tactical eye, noting details, imagining scenarios. It was automatic, unconscious. The person she had been might be buried, but that person wasn't entirely gone. The next hour was chaotic. Officers secured the scene while paramedics checked on everyone involved. Richard Matthews was shaken but uninjured. The three suspects were handcuffed and placed in separate police vehicles. And Helen Ward found herself sitting in Chief Harrison's car, trying to explain what she had just done. "You used a school bus to stop armed robbery suspects," Chief Harrison said slowly, as if saying it aloud would help him believe it. "I know how it sounds," Helen replied. Her hands were still shaking slightly, and she clasped them together in her lap. "But they were escaping. They had a hostage. And I knew the road, knew the bridge. I could trap them safely." "Safely," Chief Harrison repeated. "You had 15 children on that bus." I know. Helen closed her eyes. "I'm sorry. I saw an opportunity to stop them, and I acted. It was instinct." Instinct. Chief Harrison studied her carefully. "Mrs. Ward, I've known you for 20 years. You're the most cautious, by-the-book person I know. You've never even gotten a parking ticket. And today, you performed a tactical vehicular operation that I've only seen in law enforcement training videos." Helen said nothing. She had known this moment would come eventually. She had hoped to avoid it, but some part of her had always known her past couldn't stay buried forever. "So I'm going to ask you something," Chief Harrison continued, "and I need you to be honest with me. Who are you really, Helen Ward?" Helen looked out the window. Through the police car's windshield, she could see the school bus. Parents were arriving now, collecting their children. She saw Linda Jennings embracing Sarah and Tommy, tears streaming down her face. The children were safe. Everyone was safe. "I'm exactly who I seem to be," Helen said quietly. "I'm a 67-year-old bus driver who lives alone on Maple Avenue and volunteers at church events." "But?" Helen sighed. "But I wasn't always a bus driver." She pulled out her wallet and removed something she had carried for 22 years, but had never shown anyone in Thornfield. Her military ID card, long expired, but still valid as identification. Chief Harrison took it and read the information. His eyebrows rose. "Major Helen Ward, United States Air Force." He looked up at her. "You were a military pilot." "For 20 years, yes." "And you never mentioned this to anyone in Thornfield?" "I came here to leave that life behind," Helen said. "I came here to be someone else. Someone normal. Someone who wasn't—" She trailed off, but Chief Harrison was putting pieces together. 22 years ago. That would be 2003. You left the military right after— "Yes," Helen said simply. Chief Harrison was quiet for a moment. "I remember that story. It was in the news. A military strike that hit the wrong target. Civilian area damaged. No deaths, but people injured, displaced." "I was the pilot," Helen said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "The coordinates were wrong. The intelligence was faulty. But I was the one in the cockpit. I was the one who pressed the button." "You followed orders." "I followed orders," Helen agreed. "But that doesn't change what happened. Those people lost their homes because of me. Children were terrified because of me. I was cleared of any wrongdoing, but I couldn't keep flying after that. I couldn't keep doing that job." Chief Harrison handed back her ID. "So you came to Thornfield?" "I wanted somewhere small, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could do something simple and useful without—" Helen struggled for words. "Without the potential for that kind of catastrophic mistake." "And you became a school bus driver." "I became a bus driver," Helen confirmed. "Taking care of children, making sure they get to school safely. It seemed like maybe I could balance the scales a little bit." Chief Harrison was quiet for a long moment, processing all of this. Finally, he said, "What you did today was incredibly dangerous." "I know. You put children at risk." "I know," Helen said again, more quietly. "But," Chief Harrison continued, "you also probably saved Richard Matthews's life. If those suspects had reached the highway, we might never have caught them. They could have driven for hours with a hostage, and situations like that, they don't always end well." Helen looked at him hopefully. "So you're not going to arrest me?" "Arrest you? Helen, the mayor is probably going to want to give you a medal." He rubbed his face tiredly. "Though the school board might have some questions about proper protocol for bus drivers encountering criminal activity." "I'll resign," Helen said immediately. "I understand if they can't keep me employed after this." "Let's not jump to that yet. First, I need you to tell me everything that happened, step by step, for the official report." Helen spent the next 30 minutes giving a detailed account of events, how she had spotted the robbery, called 911, waited with the children, and then made the split-second decision to pursue when the suspects fled. She explained her tactical thinking, her knowledge of the road, her calculation that she could safely trap them at the bridge. Chief Harrison took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions. When she finished, he sat back and shook his head in amazement. "You know what's remarkable?" he said. "The way you describe it, the whole operation was completely logical. Every decision made sense based on your training and experience. You assessed risk, calculated odds, and executed a plan." "That's what I was trained to do," Helen said, "for flying planes, not driving school buses. The principles are the same. Assess, decide, act. Stay calm under pressure. Protect the people under your care." And you did protect them. Every single child on that bus is fine. Shaken up, maybe a little scared, but fine. Some of them think you're a hero. Helen shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who saw a problem and tried to fix it." "That's pretty much the definition of a hero," Chief Harrison said dryly. Before Helen could respond, there was a knock on the car window. Dorothy Fletcher stood there, looking worried. Chief Harrison rolled down the window. "Tom, I need to speak to Helen," Dorothy said firmly. "Right now." Chief Harrison looked at Helen, who nodded. "We're done here for now," he said. "Mrs. Ward, don't leave town. I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to sign your statement." Helen got out of the car, and Dorothy immediately pulled her into a fierce hug. "Don't you ever scare me like that again," Dorothy said, her voice muffled against Helen's shoulder. "I'm sorry," Helen said, hugging back. "I didn't mean to worry anyone." Dorothy pulled back, her eyes searching Helen's face. "Francis and I heard what happened. The whole town is talking about it. They're saying you stopped armed robbers with a school bus. They're saying you were some kind of tactical expert in a past life." Helen felt her stomach drop. "Dorothy, I can explain. You were military, weren't you?" Dorothy interrupted. "Don't bother denying it. I taught high school for 40 years. I know what a military bearing looks like, even when someone is trying to hide it. I always suspected there was more to your story." "You never said anything." "Because I figured if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me. Everyone deserves privacy, Helen. Everyone deserves a fresh start if they need one." Dorothy squeezed her hands. "But now the cat's out of the bag, and you need to decide how you're going to handle it." Helen looked around. A crowd had gathered at both ends of the bridge. News vans were arriving. She saw reporters with cameras and microphones. The quiet life she had built was about to become very public. "I don't know what to do," Helen admitted. "Well, first thing is we're getting you away from here before those reporters descend. Come on." Dorothy guided Helen toward her car. They drove in silence for several minutes, heading away from the bridge and the growing crowd. Finally, Helen spoke. "I came to Thornfield because I needed to disappear," she said quietly. "I needed to be somewhere I could be just Helen Ward, bus driver. Not Major Ward, not the pilot who made that terrible mistake. Just ordinary." "And you succeeded," Dorothy said. "For 22 years, you were exactly what you wanted to be. You helped raise our children. You became part of our community. You built a good life. But now everyone will know." "Know what? That you served your country? That you had a career before coming here?" Helen, that's nothing to be ashamed of. You don't understand, Helen said, her voice breaking. They'll look up my history. They'll find out about the incident. They'll learn that I bombed innocent people. Dorothy pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face Helen. Did you make a mistake? Yes. Did you hurt people? Yes. Did you do it on purpose? No, but did you take responsibility? Helen hesitated. I resigned. I left the military. I came here. That sounds like taking responsibility to me, Dorothy said firmly. Helen, you've spent 22 years punishing yourself for a mistake you made while serving your country. You followed bad intelligence, hit the wrong target, and people got hurt. That's terrible. But it was an accident in a war zone. It wasn't murder. It wasn't malicious. It was a tragic mistake. Tell that to the people who lost their homes. I'm sure they were devastated. I'm sure they're still angry. But Helen, have you forgiven yourself? The question hung in the air. Helen stared out the window, watching the autumn leaves blow across the empty road. No, she finally whispered. I haven't. Maybe it's time, Dorothy said gently. Maybe that's what today was about. Not just stopping some criminals, but remembering that you have value, that your skills matter, that you can still make a difference. Helen wiped her eyes. I just wanted to be normal. Honey, you drive a school bus full of screaming children every day, and you volunteer for every community event. You're about as normal as they come. Dorothy started the car again. But maybe you're allowed to be a little extraordinary, too. They drove to Helen's house. Dorothy insisted on coming inside and making tea, refusing to let Helen be alone. They sat at the kitchen table, and Helen found herself talking. Really talking. About her military career. About the incident. About the PTSD, the nightmares, the guilt. About choosing Thornfield and building a new life. Dorothy listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just being present. When Helen finally ran out of words, she felt exhausted, but somehow lighter. Thank you, Helen said quietly, for listening. For not what? Being horrified? Running away? Helen, we're friends. Friends don't abandon each other when things get complicated. There was a knock at the door. Helen tensed, but Dorothy went to answer it. It was Frances Moretti, carrying a casserole dish. I figured you wouldn't feel like cooking, Frances announced, bustling into the kitchen. And before you ask, yes, Dorothy called me and told me you were here, and yes, I know what happened, and no, I don't care about your past except to say thank you for your service. Helen blinked. Thank you for my service? You were military. You served our country. That deserves respect, regardless of what happened. Frances set the casserole in the oven and turned to face Helen. And today, you saved Richard Matthews and stopped those criminals. So as far as I'm concerned, you're a genuine hero. I'm not. Yes, you are, Frances interrupted firmly. Accept it. The doorbell rang again. And again. Over the next hour, a steady stream of Thornfield residents appeared at Helen's door. Linda Jennings came with Sarah and Tommy, all of them hugging Helen and thanking her. Officer Davidson stopped by to check on her. Even Chief Harrison appeared briefly to say that Richard Matthews wanted to speak to her when she was ready. Through it all, Helen sat in her living room in a daze, accepting thanks and hugs from people who, just that morning, had known her as quiet, ordinary Helen Ward. Now they knew she was extraordinary. And instead of being angry about her secrets, they were grateful. Helen didn't sleep well that night. She kept replaying the day's events in her mind, the high-speed pursuit, the confrontation on the bridge, the look on the children's faces. She also thought about all the conversations afterward, about Dorothy's words about forgiveness, about the community's surprising acceptance. At 3 a.m., she finally gave up on sleep and made herself tea. Sitting at her kitchen table in the dark, Helen faced a truth she had been avoiding for 22 years. Running away hadn't actually solved anything. She had thought that leaving the military and hiding in a small town would let her escape her guilt. But the guilt had followed her. It was there every morning when she woke up. It was there in the nightmares she still occasionally had. It was there in her reluctance to accept praise or recognition. For 2 decades, she had been trying to earn forgiveness through good deeds, driving children safely, volunteering endlessly, being helpful to everyone. But deep down, she had never believed she deserved forgiveness. She had never believed she deserved peace. Now, however, something had shifted. When she had seen those criminals escaping with a hostage, Helen hadn't thought about her past or her guilt. She had simply acted. She had used her skills and training to help someone. And it had worked. Maybe Dorothy was right. Maybe it was time to stop punishing herself. Not to forget what happened or to claim it didn't matter, but to acknowledge that she had done everything she could to make amends. She had left a career she loved. She had dedicated herself to serving her new community. She had tried, every day, to be a good person. Perhaps that was enough. As dawn broke over Thornfield, Helen made a decision. She would face this situation head-on. No more hiding, no more secrets. If the town wanted to know about her past, she would tell them the truth, all of it, including the parts that were hard to hear. At 8 a.m., she called Chief Harrison. "I'd like to make a public statement," she said, "about my past and about yesterday. Can you help me arrange that?" Chief Harrison was quiet for a moment. "Helen, are you sure? You don't owe anyone an explanation." "Maybe not, but I owe them honesty. These people welcomed me into their community. They deserve to know who I really am." "All right, I'll set something up for this afternoon at the town hall." Word spread quickly. By 2 p.m., when Helen arrived at the town hall, the main meeting room was packed. It seemed like half of Thornfield had shown up. Helen saw familiar faces everywhere, parents of her bus children, fellow volunteers, store owners, neighbors. Dorothy and Francis sat in the front row, offering encouraging smiles. Mayor Patricia Wilson introduced Helen briefly, then stepped aside. Helen stood at the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she began to speak. "Thank you all for coming. I know there are a lot of questions about yesterday and about my background. I'm going to try to answer them honestly." She took a deep breath. "My name is Helen Ward. I'm 67 years old. I've lived in Thornfield for 22 years, and I've been a school bus driver for 20 of those years. But before I came to Thornfield, I served in the United States Air Force for 20 years as a pilot." A murmur went through the crowd, though most had clearly heard rumors already. "I was trained to fly fighter jets and transport aircraft. I served in various conflicts and operations around the world. I achieved the rank of major, and I was proud of my service. Flying was my passion and my calling." Helen paused, gathering courage for the hard part. But 22 years ago, I was involved in an incident during a mission. I received orders to strike what was identified as a military target. The intelligence was wrong. The coordinates were wrong. When I completed the mission, I had struck a civilian residential area. The room was completely silent now. Helen forced herself to continue. No one was killed, thank God, but people were injured. Families lost their homes. Children were traumatized. The military investigation found that I had followed proper procedures and wasn't at fault for the intelligence failure. But I was the pilot. I was the one who carried out the strike, and I couldn't live with that. She saw some people nodding, some looking shocked, some just listening intently. I developed PTSD. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't fly without seeing those images of the damaged neighborhood. So I resigned my commission and left the military. I came to Thornfield because I needed somewhere small and quiet, somewhere I could do something simple and useful, somewhere I could try to balance the scales, I guess. Helen looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. I never told anyone here about my past because I was ashamed. I was afraid of being judged. I was afraid people would see me as the person who hurt innocent people, not as the person I was trying to become. Yesterday, when I saw those criminals escaping, something in me just clicked. I saw a situation where my old training could help, where I could potentially save someone. I didn't think about the risk or the protocol. I just acted. And yes, I used skills I learned in the military to stop that car. I know I put children at risk. I know I broke probably a dozen rules and regulations. If the school board wants my resignation, they'll have it. But I want you all to understand, I did what I thought was right in that moment. And I would do it again, to save Richard Matthews's life. She gripped the podium, coming to her conclusion. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who made a terrible mistake a long time ago and has been trying to make up for it ever since. Driving your children safely to school every day. That's my redemption. Volunteering in this community. That's my penance. Being part of Thornfield. That's my second chance. I understand if some of you are angry that I kept secrets. I understand if you don't trust me anymore. But I want you to know that everything I've done in this town, I did genuinely. My friendship with you was real. My care for your children was real. Helen Ward, the bus driver, is just as real as Major Ward, the pilot. Maybe more real, because I chose this life. I chose Thornfield. And I'm grateful for every day I've spent here. She stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding. For a moment, there was silence. Then someone started clapping. Linda Jennings stood up, applauding. Sarah and Tommy stood with her. Then Dorothy and Francis. Then more people, until the entire room was on its feet, applauding. Helen stood there, stunned, as the people of Thornfield gave her a standing ovation. She saw tears on some faces, smiles on others. These people weren't rejecting her, they were accepting her. All of her, including the parts she had tried to hide. Mayor Wilson returned to the podium. Thank you, Helen, for your honesty and your service, both military and civilian. I think I speak for everyone when I say that Thornfield is proud to call you one of our own. She turned to the crowd. Now, I know folks have questions. Helen has agreed to answer them, so let's keep this civil and respectful, please. Hands shot up immediately. Mayor Wilson called on Mr. Patterson first. Helen, thank you for your honesty. My question is simple. Are you okay? After everything that happened yesterday, are you doing all right? The question, in its simplicity and kindness, nearly undid Helen's composure. I'm okay, Mr. Patterson. Shaken up, but okay. Thank you for asking. More questions followed. Most were supportive, asking about her military service or yesterday's events. A few were harder. Mrs. Ward, a woman Helen didn't know well, asked, "You said you hurt innocent people. How do we know you won't have some kind of flashback and do something dangerous while driving our children?" It was a fair question, and Helen answered it honestly. I've been driving your children safely for 20 years. I've been in treatment for PTSD since the incident. I know my triggers. I know my limits, and I would never put those children at risk. But if the community feels safer with a different driver, I'll understand. Chief Harrison stood up. If I may address that concern, I've reviewed Mrs. Ward's employment record. 20 years without a single incident. Not one accident, not one complaint. She has the safest driving record in the district. Her condition, which she's managed responsibly for over 2 decades, has never impacted her work. The woman nodded, seemingly satisfied. The questions continued for over an hour. Some people wanted to know about her military experiences. Others wanted to know why she chose Thornfield. A few simply wanted to express their gratitude for yesterday's actions. Finally, a young man in the back raised his hand. Mayor Wilson called on him. Mrs. Ward, my name is James Chen. You don't know me, but you drive my younger sister Emma every day. She loves you. She talks about you all the time. Yesterday, my mom was at work and couldn't get away, and she was terrified something would happen to Emma during all that police activity. James's voice got thick with emotion. But Emma came home safe because you kept her safe. Not just yesterday, but every day for years. So on behalf of my family, thank you. We don't care what happened 22 years ago in some war zone. We care that you took care of our little sister. That's what matters to us. Helen couldn't hold back tears anymore. Thank you, James. That means everything to me. The meeting concluded shortly after, with Mayor Wilson reminding everyone that Helen deserved privacy and respect as the community processed this information. As people filed out, many stopped to speak to Helen personally, to shake her hand or hug her. Richard Matthews approached with his wife. The bank manager looked tired, but healthy. Mrs. Ward, he said, I owe you my life. Those men were getting desperate. If you hadn't stopped them when you did, he shook his head. Thank you doesn't seem adequate, but thank you. Helen hugged him. I'm just glad you're safe, Richard. As the crowd thinned, Helen found herself alone with Dorothy, Francis, and Chief Harrison. That was incredibly brave, Dorothy said, telling them everything. It was time, Helen replied. I'm tired of hiding. Well, for what it's worth, you handled that beautifully, Chief Harrison said. And Helen, the school board wants to meet with you tomorrow, but I've already spoken to them. They're not asking for your resignation. They want to discuss some protocol updates and maybe some additional training for drivers in emergency situations. But they want you to keep your job. Helen felt relief wash over her. Really? Really. You're too valuable to lose. Though I suspect you'll have to endure being called a hero for a while. I can live with that, Helen said with a small smile. The next few days were strange. Helen's story spread beyond Thornfield, picked up by regional and then national news. School bus driver uses military training to stop bank robbers, made for good headlines. Reporters called requesting interviews. Television producers wanted her to appear on morning shows. Helen declined almost all of them. She gave one interview to a local newspaper, mainly to ensure accurate information was available, but otherwise avoided the media spotlight. She had lived a quiet life for 2 decades, and she wasn't interested in fame now. The school board meeting was constructive. They discussed emergency protocols and decided to add training for all drivers on what to do in crisis situations. They praised Helen's quick thinking, but also gently reminded her that safety was paramount. Next time, if there was a next time, she should focus solely on keeping children safe and leave police work to police. Helen accepted this guidance without argument. She had gotten lucky that everything worked out. She knew it could easily have gone differently. What surprised Helen most was how little actually changed in her daily life. Yes, people now knew her history. Yes, she was occasionally stopped in the grocery store by people wanting to thank her. But fundamentally, life in Thornfield continued as before. She still drove her route every morning and afternoon. The children still greeted her happily, though now they sometimes asked questions about flying planes, which Helen answered carefully. Parents still trusted her with their kids. She still had coffee with Dorothy and Francis every Tuesday. The difference was internal. Helen felt lighter somehow, as if a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted. Keeping secrets was exhausting work. Being known, truly known, was liberating. 3 weeks after the incident, on a cool November morning, Helen was approached at the Bluebird Cafe by a stranger. He was in his late 40s, wearing a military uniform with the insignia of a colonel. "Major Ward," he said formally. "Colonel Robert Morrison. May I speak with you?" Helen's breath caught. Morrison. The same last name as her former squadron mate. "Are you related to Captain Robert Morrison?" "He was my father." Colonel Morrison's expression softened slightly. "He spoke of you often before he died. Said you were one of the best pilots he ever flew with." "Your father was a good man and a good officer. I was sorry to hear about his accident." "Thank you. Ma'am, I'm actually here officially. May we speak privately?" They moved to a quiet corner table. Colonel Morrison pulled out some papers. "I heard about the incident here. Your actions were impressive, but they also came to the attention of some people in the Air Force who remember your service." "I'm retired, Colonel." "I know. But Major Ward, Helen, you were given a raw deal 22 years ago. That intelligence failure wasn't your fault. The after-action reports make that clear. Yet you took it on yourself and left a career you loved." Helen said carefully, "I did what I needed to do for my own peace of mind." "I understand. But there are some people who would like to formally acknowledge that you were treated unfairly. They'd like to offer an apology on behalf of the service and perhaps provide some recognition of your exemplary career." Helen was quiet for a long moment. "What kind of recognition?" "Nothing big or public, unless you want that, but an official acknowledgement of your service. A formal apology for how the incident was handled, and possibly some updated documentation that makes clear you left with honor." "Why now? Why after all these years?" Colonel Morrison smiled slightly. "Because sometimes it takes an extraordinary act by a school bus driver to remind people that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Your actions here showed exactly the kind of judgment and skill that made you an excellent officer. Some of us felt it was past time to set the record straight. Helen thought about this. For 22 years, she had carried the shame of that incident as a private burden. Official recognition wouldn't change what happened, but perhaps it would help close that chapter more definitively. "I'd like that," she said finally. "But quietly, please. No press, no ceremony. I've built a life here, and I'd like to keep it simple." "Understood. I'll make the arrangements." Colonel Morrison stood and extended his hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Major Ward. My father was right about you." After he left, Helen sat alone with her coffee, processing this unexpected development. The Air Force wanted to apologize. After all these years, they wanted to set the record straight. It wouldn't change the past. Those people in that residential area would still have been displaced because of her actions. But perhaps it would help her finally forgive herself. Dorothy appeared at her elbow. "Everything okay?" That looked like a serious conversation. "It was," Helen said. "But in a good way, I think." She explained about Colonel Morrison's visit. Dorothy listened, then reached over and squeezed Helen's hand. "I'm glad," she said simply. "You deserve that closure." "Do I, though? Those people I hurt." "Did you apologize?" "Through channels, yes. After the incident, I wrote letters. I don't know if they ever received them." "Did you mean it?" "With all my heart." "Did you change your life to try to do better?" "Yes." "Then yes, Helen. You deserve closure. You deserve forgiveness, including from yourself." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Then Frances burst through the door, out of breath. "Helen! Helen, you need to come see this." "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Just come." Frances led them outside and pointed down Main Street. A large banner had been hung across the street. "Thornfield thanks our heroes, police, fire, and Helen Ward." Helen stared at it, torn between embarrassment and emotion. "Did the town council do this?" "Everyone did this," Frances said proudly. "We all contributed. Because, Helen, you're part of this community. You're our neighbor, our friend. And yes, you're our hero." Helen felt tears welling up. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Dorothy assured her. "Just accept it. Accept that you're valued. Accept that you belong." Looking at the banner, at her two friends, at the town she had called home for over 2 decades, Helen finally allowed herself to believe it. She did belong. She had found her place not despite her past, but incorporating it. The pilot and the bus driver weren't separate people. They were both Helen Ward, and both had value. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Winter came to Thornfield, blanketing the town in snow and bringing the busy holiday season. Helen continued her routes, now driving through snowy streets with the same care she had always shown. The children were excited about Christmas, chattering about presents and Santa Claus. "Mrs. Ward," Tommy Jennings asked one morning, "did you ever fly planes in the snow?" "I did, Tommy. Military pilots train to fly in all kinds of weather." "Even blizzards?" "Even blizzards. Though I'll tell you a secret. I prefer driving a school bus in snow. It's safer, and I get to be with wonderful kids like you." Tommy beamed at this response. and Helen smiled. She had learned to talk about her military past without pain now. It was simply part of who she was, no more or less important than any other aspect of her life. In mid-December, Helen received a package in the mail. Inside was official documentation from the Department of the Air Force, a formal letter of apology for how the incident had been investigated and communicated, acknowledgement of her exemplary service record, and updated discharge papers that explicitly stated she had left with honor and distinction. There was also a personal note from Colonel Morrison. Major Ward, my father used to say that the measure of a pilot isn't how they handle perfect conditions, but how they respond when everything goes wrong. You responded to the worst moment of your career with integrity and dignity. You took responsibility, sought help, and rebuilt your life in service to others. That's the definition of honor. Thank you for your service, both in uniform and out. Respectfully, Colonel Robert Morrison. Helen read the letter 3 times, then carefully filed the documents away. They didn't change the past, but they helped her make peace with it. She had been a good pilot who made one terrible mistake. She had been a good person trying to do her best in impossible circumstances. She was allowed to forgive herself. The town's Christmas festival was scheduled for December 20th. Helen had volunteered to help with setup, as she did every year. But this year, Mayor Wilson had asked her to do something more. We'd like you to light the town Christmas tree, the mayor said. It's traditionally been done by someone who has contributed significantly to the community. And Helen, your contribution over the past 22 years has been immeasurable. Helen tried to decline, uncomfortable with the attention, but Dorothy and Frances wouldn't let her. Accept the honor graciously, Frances instructed. The town wants to celebrate you. Let them. So on a cold, clear December evening, Helen found herself standing in front of Thornfield's town square with what seemed like the entire community gathered around. The mayor gave a short speech about community, service, and heroism in everyday life. And now, Mayor Wilson concluded, please join me in welcoming Helen Ward, who will light our tree this year. Helen stepped forward to applause. She was given a ceremonial switch and, on the count of 3, flipped it. The Christmas tree burst into light, its hundreds of bulbs illuminating the square in warm, colorful glow. The crowd cheered and children squealed with delight. Christmas music started playing from speakers. Families began to mingle, enjoying hot chocolate and cookies provided by local businesses. Helen found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Parents thanked her again for her care of their children. Richard Matthews and his wife came by to invite her to Christmas dinner. The children from her route ran up excitedly to tell her about their holiday plans. Standing there in the glow of the Christmas lights, surrounded by neighbors and friends, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Complete acceptance. Not just of her present, but of her entire story. The good and the bad. The achievements and the mistakes. All of it was part of who she was. Later, as the crowd began to thin, Helen stood with Dorothy and Frances, watching families head home through the snow. Happy, dear? Dorothy asked quietly. Helen thought about the question. Was she happy? 22 years ago, happiness had seemed impossible. She had been drowning in guilt and trauma, barely able to function. She had come to Thornfield not seeking happiness, but seeking peace, seeking simply to survive. But somewhere along the way, through years of quiet service and gradual healing, through friendships and community and purpose, she had found more than survival. She had found a life worth living. Yes, Helen said, surprised to realize it was true. I am happy. Good, Frances declared, because you deserve it. As December turned to January, life in Thornfield settled into its winter rhythm. Helen continued driving her routes, watching her regular passengers grow and change. Sarah Jennings was working on a science fair project about aerodynamics and kept asking Helen questions about how planes fly. Tommy was joining the school safety patrol and took his responsibilities very seriously. Emma Rodriguez had become much more outgoing, even organizing a campaign to collect books for the library. These children, whom Helen had transported safely for years, were growing up. In a few years, they'd be too old for the elementary school bus. They'd move on to middle school, then high school, then out into the world. Helen would likely retire before then. At 67, she was already past normal retirement age. But for now, every morning and afternoon, she was there for them. Reliable Helen Ward, making sure they got where they needed to go safely. One February morning, Helen was surprised to see a formal-looking envelope in her mailbox. Inside was an invitation to a reunion of her old squadron, those who had served together in Strike Team Phoenix. Helen's first instinct was to decline. Facing her former colleagues seemed daunting. But she thought about what Dorothy had said about accepting her entire story. The good parts of her military service were part of that story too. She RSVP'd that she would attend. The reunion was held in April at a hotel near the Air Force Base where Strike Team Phoenix had been stationed. Helen drove there on a Saturday morning, her nerves building as she got closer. But when she walked into the hotel conference room and saw familiar faces, decades older but still recognizable, something in her relaxed. Helen! Lieutenant Sarah Keller, now Major General Keller, greeted her with a warm hug. My God, it's good to see you. General Keller. Congratulations on the stars. It's Sarah here. We're all just old pilots today. She pulled Helen toward a group of former squadron mates. Everyone, look who made it. The next several hours were filled with stories and laughter. They talked about old missions, remembered colleagues who had died, caught up on their current lives. Several were still serving. Others had retired and moved into civilian careers. A few had become instructors, passing their knowledge to the next generation. Helen shared what she had been doing, 20 years as a school bus driver in a small town. Some seemed surprised, but no one was judgmental. These were people who understood that everyone's path after service was different. Late in the evening, over dinner, one of her former squadron mates, Captain James O'Brien, now a retired airline pilot, brought up the incident. Helen, we all heard what happened after you left, that mission with the bad coordinates. I'm sorry you went through that alone. I wasn't alone, Helen said. I had support from the military, counseling, but not from us. Not from your squadron. James looked around the table. We should have reached out. You were one of us, and we let you disappear. There were nods of agreement around the table. Helen felt emotion welling up. I pushed everyone away, she admitted. I was so ashamed, so broken. I didn't think I deserved your friendship. That's nonsense, Sarah said firmly. You were the best pilot I ever flew with. One mistake based on faulty intelligence doesn't erase 20 years of excellent service. We should have told you that. We should have fought for you. It's okay, Helen said. I needed to leave. I needed to find a different path. And I did. I built a good life. Tell us about it, James encouraged. About this school bus driving. So Helen told them about Thornfield, about the children she drove every day, about the community she had become part of, about Dorothy and Francis, about the bank robbery and her unexpected return to tactical thinking. They listened with obvious admiration. So you're still saving lives, Sarah observed. Just different lives, in a different way. I hadn't thought of it like that, Helen said slowly. But maybe you're right. The reunion continued late into the night. By the time Helen left, she had exchanged phone numbers and email addresses with everyone. They made promises to stay in touch, and Helen believed they would. These people understood her in a way few others could. They had shared not just a profession, but a calling. Driving home the next morning, Helen reflected on how far she had come. She had faced her past, not just the traumatic incident, but all of it. The achievements, the camaraderie, the pride she had taken in her work. She didn't have to reject all of that in order to make peace with the mistake. Spring came to Thornfield, bringing with it blooming flowers and the town's annual spring festival. This year's festival had a special addition. The community garden that Francis had proposed months ago was finally being dedicated. Helen had been heavily involved in the garden's creation, helping design the layout, teaching workshops on planting techniques, and working alongside volunteers to prepare the plots. Now, on a sunny May morning, the town gathered to officially open the Thornfield Community Garden. Mayor Wilson gave a speech thanking everyone involved, with special recognition for Francis's vision and Helen's expertise. Then Francis stepped to the microphone. I want to say something about leadership, Francis began. When I first proposed this garden, I expected I'd have to push and cajole and beg for help. Instead, people in this town stepped up immediately. They donated time, supplies, and knowledge. And leading that effort, quietly but effectively, was Helen Ward. Helen felt her cheeks flush as Francis continued. Helen has a saying. She told it to me while we were planning this garden. She said, "If you want to make a difference, start small and start close to home." That's how she's lived her life in Thornfield. Small actions, done consistently, close to home. She drives children safely to school. She volunteers at every community event. She helps her neighbors. She shares her gardening knowledge freely. None of these are grand gestures, but together they've made this town better. They've made all our lives richer. Francis looked directly at Helen. You taught me that heroism isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just showing up every day and doing the work that needs doing. Thank you for being that kind of hero. The crowd applauded, and Helen wiped away tears. These past few months, since the bank robbery incident, she had been forced to accept a lot of recognition. But this, more than anything else, captured what she had been trying to do in Thornfield. Not to be heroic, but to be useful, to be present, to make small differences that accumulated over time. After the ceremony, Helen walked through the garden plots with Dorothy. Already, volunteers had planted tomatoes, beans, peppers, and dozens of other vegetables. By summer, this space would be green and flourishing. You did a good thing here, Dorothy said. Francis did the good thing. I just helped. That's what you always say. I just helped. But Helen, helping is how the world gets better. One person helping another. One small garden plot. One child safely driven to school. It all matters. They walked in silence for a moment. Then Dorothy said, "I heard you're thinking of retiring." Helen nodded. "At the end of this school year, I'll be 68. It's time." "What will you do?" "I don't know yet. Travel, maybe. Francis keeps insisting I need to see the ocean." Helen smiled. "Maybe I'll finally take that vacation she's been bothering me about." "You should. You've earned it." Dorothy paused. "But you'll come back. You're not leaving Thornfield?" "Of course I'm coming back. This is home." "Good, because we'd miss you terribly if you left." The remainder of the school year passed quickly. In June, Helen drove her last route as an official school bus driver. The school district threw her a retirement party, attended by years' worth of former passengers and their families. Helen was presented with a scrapbook filled with thank you notes and drawings from students past and present. "To Mrs. Ward," read one note from a high school senior who had ridden her bus a decade ago. "Thank you for always being the safe, steady presence at the beginning and end of every school day. You taught me that reliability is a superpower." Another from Tommy Jennings. "Mrs. Ward, you're the coolest bus driver ever. Thank you for teaching me about planes and keeping us safe. I want to be a pilot like you someday." Helen read through every note, her heart full. This was her legacy, not medals or commendations, but the quiet impact of showing up every day and caring for children. It was a legacy she was proud of. In July, Helen did something she hadn't done in 23 years. She took a vacation. Dorothy and Francis came with her, and the three women spent a week at the coast, walking on beaches and eating seafood and laughing together. One evening, Helen stood alone on the beach, watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from military pilot to traumatized veteran to school bus driver to accepted community member. It hadn't been the life she had planned at 25, full of ambition and confidence. But it was a good life, a meaningful life. Behind her, she heard Dorothy and Francis calling her name. Time for dinner. Time to rejoin her friends. Helen smiled, took one last look at the ocean, and turned toward the voices of the people who loved her. She was no longer Major Helen Ward fighter pilot. She was no longer even Helen Ward school bus driver. She was simply Helen, friend, neighbor, community member. And finally, after all these years, that was enough. Epilogue. The next generation. 5 years later, Helen sat in the audience at Thornfield High School's graduation ceremony. She was 72 now, her hair completely white, but her eyes were still sharp and her posture still military straight. On the stage, Tommy Jennings was giving the valedictorian speech. He had grown into a confident young man, passionate about aviation and engineering. He had been accepted to the Air Force Academy with plans to become a pilot. "I want to thank the people who inspired me," Tommy was saying. "My parents, my teachers, and especially Mrs. Helen Ward, who drove my school bus for years and taught me that the most important thing in any profession is taking care of the people who depend on you." Tommy looked directly at Helen in the audience. "Mrs. Ward showed me that being a pilot isn't just about flying planes. It's about responsibility, about safety, about service. She's the reason I want to serve my country. She showed me what real heroism looks like." After the ceremony, Tommy approached Helen with his parents and sister. "Mrs. Ward," he said formally, "I want you to have something." He handed her a small box. Inside was a pin, pilot's wings, identical to the ones Helen had worn in her Air Force uniform decades ago. "These belong to my grandfather," Tommy explained. "He flew transport planes in Vietnam. My mom gave them to me when I got accepted to the academy, but I want you to have them. You're the pilot who inspired me." Helen looked at Linda Jennings, who nodded with tears in her eyes. "Dad would have wanted you to have them," Linda said. "He always respected people who served with honor. That's you, Helen." Helen accepted the wings with trembling hands. "Tommy, I'll treasure these, and I'll be watching your career with pride." "I hope I can be half the pilot you were," Tommy said. "You'll be better," Helen assured him, "because you'll learn from my mistakes and my successes both. That's how each generation improves on the last." Walking home that evening, Helen held the pilot's wings carefully. She thought about the circle that had completed itself, from her own service to Tommy's inspiration to serve. She hadn't been able to save her own career, but perhaps she had helped launch someone else's. That night, Helen added the wings to a small display in her home, not hidden in a box anymore, but visible. The display included her own military medals, Emma Rodriguez's drawing of the school bus, photographs from her retirement party, and now Tommy's gift. All pieces of her story, all parts of her life, finally integrated and accepted. The next morning, she met Dorothy and Francis at the Bluebird Cafe, as they did every Tuesday morning. They talked about the graduation, about their gardens, about the upcoming town festival. "You know what I've been thinking?" Francis said suddenly. "We should write a book about Thornfield, about all the people here and their stories, about what makes a community work." "That's a lovely idea," Dorothy agreed. "And Helen, you should write a chapter about finding home after trauma, about building a new life." "About redemption," Helen added quietly. "About redemption," Dorothy confirmed. "Do you think you could do that? Write about your journey?" Helen considered this. For so many years, she had wanted to forget her story, to hide it away. But now, she understood that her story might help others, other veterans struggling with guilt, other people looking for second chances, other communities learning to embrace complicated pasts. "Yes," Helen said. "I think I could do that." And so she did. Helen wrote her story, not all of it, but enough. She wrote about making mistakes and learning to forgive yourself. She wrote about the power of community and simple, daily acts of service. She wrote about how heroism comes in many forms, from military missions to school bus routes. Most importantly, she wrote about how it's never too late to start again, to find purpose, to make a difference. She had been 45 when she came to Thornfield, broken and lost. Now she was 72, whole and found. Her chapter in the book about Thornfield was titled simply, "Finding Home." It ended with these words: "I came to this town seeking anonymity. What I found was belonging. I came seeking to hide from my past. What I found was acceptance of my entire story. I came believing I had nothing left to offer. What I found was purpose in the smallest daily acts. Thornfield gave me a second chance at life. In return, I gave what I could. Safe passage for children, helping hands for neighbors, commitment to community. It wasn't heroic. It was simply showing up, day after day, and doing the work that needed doing. But perhaps that's what heroism really is. Not grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but consistent care for others. Not perfection, but persistence. Not never falling, but getting up and trying again. I was Major Helen Ward, fighter pilot. I am Helen Ward, retired bus driver and Thornfield resident. Both are true. Both matter. And I am at peace with both. The book was published locally and became popular in Thornfield and surrounding towns. Helen received letters from people thanking her for her honesty, for showing that mistakes don't define us, for demonstrating that ordinary life can be extraordinary. And every Tuesday morning, you could find her at the Bluebird Cafe with Dorothy and Francis, drinking coffee and talking about gardens and grandchildren and community projects. Just 3 elderly women enjoying their friendship and their town. But if you looked closely, you might notice the quiet confidence in Helen's posture, the sharp awareness in her eyes, the way she automatically scanned every room she entered. You might notice the pilot's wings pin she sometimes wore on her jacket. You might hear the respect in people's voices when they greeted her. Helen Ward had been many things: pilot, major, veteran, bus driver, friend, neighbor, hero. But most importantly, she had been and continued to be someone who showed up every day and did her best. In the end, that was the only heroism that really mattered. And Thornfield, with its banners and gardens and grateful residents, would never forget the woman who taught them that lesson. One school bus route at a time. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.